PharmaVentures, experts in deals and alliances.
Hello and welcome to PharmaVentures Insights. Regulation is an important part of both therapeutics and medical devices. And recently there were changes in the medical device and IVD regulations. On the show today I have Ben Jacoby, an expert in regulatory affairs. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hi.
So the recent changes, these are the European medical device directives, is that correct?
Yes, the European medical device regulations, yes.
Right. And they cover IVD, or is that a separate regulation?
There are two regulations. One covers medical devices and the other one covers in vitro diagnostic medical devices.
And is there much difference between the two, or?
There's a lot of commonality actually, but there are some things where IVDs really are different from medical devices, so the regulations reflect those differences. But for the most part, they're very similar.
And to be clear, these are now enshrined in law, so anybody developing or bringing a device or a diagnostic to market has to adhere to these.
Well, they don't have to adhere to them at the moment. They're actually in force, they've entered into force, but there's a transition period. Mm-hmm. So there's 3 years for medical devices and there's 5 years for IVD medical devices. During the transitional period, the manufacturer can decide whether he wants to go with the new regulation or the old directives. So they have the choice. Actually, right now, it would be difficult for any manufacturer to comply with the new regulation because not all the structures are in place.
Right.
So it's entered into force, but it's not.
Okay. So but they are quite different then, so there will be significant changes.
There will be significant changes.
Okay, we'll come back to those changes, but so to be clear, this is European, EU only.
That's correct. It's European only, but a lot of countries outside Europe look to Europe for their regulatory system, and it has impacts, therefore, which cover the whole Mediterranean area. It covers large areas of Asia-Pacific. Countries like Australia would be concerned to a greater or lesser extent, and countries in Asia. So it does have quite an impact even outside of Europe.
And what's happening, you mentioned Asia and you mentioned the sort of MENA region and Mediterranean region. What about China, India, US? Are they aligning or are they completely different?
They're really not affected directly. However, some of the initiatives that the European Commission has taken affect or are designed to harmonise the approach. So if we take an example of unique device identification, Europe is following, if you like, a lead from the US, and Europe will implement the requirements. Generally, they'll be fairly similar. I can't say that they'll be identical in every degree because they won't be, but there's a large degree of similarity.
So anybody, again, developing or bringing one of these entities to market, they've now got multiple masters to serve in terms of getting their product on the market.
Yeah, so if a company wants to market a device in, say, China, Europe and US, this new regulation for medical devices doesn't really change that. They still have to comply with European requirements, they have to comply with US requirements, and then they've got to comply with Chinese requirements. So it's not a global harmonization. It's a sort of step towards that, but it's not complete.
Okay. So does this mean it's going to be more difficult for the smaller innovators who obviously have limited resources to comply with all the regulations around the world compared to the big companies who obviously can just do this and they can just comply? Well, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, if you ask the European Commission, the party line would be that it doesn't disadvantage small companies. However, in my opinion, and it's just an opinion, the new regulations are much more complex and more demanding than the original directives. And I think that there will be costs associated with this, and I think it's a lot for small companies to get to grips with, a lot to understand and a lot to implement. So I think it will have a big impact.
And people should keep this in mind. Obviously, if you're a new startup with a great idea in medical devices, you should bear in mind that there's going to be an impact here and plan for that with the investment you raise, so you can afford to comply with these regulations. Otherwise, you're forced to do a deal earlier, maybe at a point which is suboptimal.
Yes, I think any manufacturer now, either based in Europe or based outside Europe, but wanting to sell into Europe, they have to get to grips with the new regulations, whether they like it or not. And the sooner they do that, the better, because it's in their interest to tackle this early on, because there are a lot of ramifications, and it can't all be done at the midnight hour.
No. You mentioned complexity there.
Yes.
Perhaps you could give us an idea or an example, perhaps, of what you mean by complexity.
Yeah, well, the current directives, the current European directives, are themselves relatively complex, but they are also relatively short. So the existing directives, for example, the Medical Device Directive is something like 60 pages. The new regulation, I think, is 175 pages. Now, page length and complexity are not the same, but there's a lot more in it, and there's a lot more pages to get to grips with. So I would say, overall, there is more complexity, there is more stuff for small companies and large companies to take account of.
Is this going to slow down the time that it takes people to get products to market? Or is it supposed to speed it up even?
I don't think it's going to speed it up. I think if you ask the European Commission, the party line would be this has no impact on time to market. But realistically, I think it will have a big impact. There will be more pressure on medical device manufacturers with new products. There'll be more pressure to do clinical investigations, which are expensive and which take time.
So if there's added expense, is this going to make it harder for new innovation to make it to market?
Again, the party line is no, and the European Commission did an impact assessment, and I believe that showed that the impacts were modest. However, if you speak to people in the field, people tell me, and I think myself, that the impacts are really quite big for small companies.
Okay, I mean, inherently people don't like change, but once the change comes, views often change and say, oh no, this is much better. Do you expect that to be the case here?
Well, I'm getting this from big companies. So the larger companies are saying, yes, it's a pain, yes, they've got to spend money, yes, there's more complexity, but they see it as a way of getting competitive advantage. And in some cases, and this is not a cynical point, but there will be small companies who will struggle, and some of them will be acquired or will partner with large companies. So there'll be opportunities for large companies.
Right.
But large companies also see this as a good way of doing business, and they can get advantage from it. So it's not all negative by any means.
No, and not just rules for rules' sake. It actually will drive economic and competitive advantage, as you said.
Yes, and also one has to mention patient safety and aspects related to that.
Because that, after all, is the nub of what the regulators are there for. It's about patient safety.
It's about patient safety. The economic impacts, yes, they're there, but that's not really what it's about.
So we've talked about this being a European regulation. In the not too distant future, the UK will no longer be part of Europe, and there's a lot of things still to be resolved, and not least how we will be regulated. What do you see as the impact of this on the situation in the UK?
I'm always getting asked this question, and it's a really difficult question to answer, and I wish I had the answers. But the way I advise clients is that basically, from a regulatory point of view, we are part of Europe, we are part of the European system. I don't believe that that's going to change. So for the most part, I think we will stick with CE marking, I think we will stick with the medical device regulations, but perhaps around the periphery there might be one or two issues around, say, notified bodies or authorised representatives. It's possible that depending on what sort of deal is done by the UK, there could be some changes there. But I think they will be peripheral, even minor, and the main thrust of the regulation will be exactly the same, and we'll do CE marking in exactly the same way. One point I would like to mention, though, is that I think we as a country will lose influence through this, because at the moment we're part of the EU and we have a big say in what goes on, and we have a big influence over what goes on. I believe that that will change, and that in the new order we'll have to accept everything that Europe comes up with, but we won't be able to influence it, not directly anyway.
So that again points to something you said before, which is you need to understand the regulations and also get good advice and know where you're going and how you need to comply with this.
Yes, I mean, I'm a consultant, so I would say that anyway. But the reality is that it is a lot, particularly for small companies to take on board, and it does help to have a consultant or somebody to advise them on how to approach such a difficult change, and a change which affects probably every part of a company, every function of a company will be affected by these regulations.
And if people want to see what these regulations are, they can come to you and get them, but where would they find them? Are they on the internet?
Yes, so you just download them from the European Commission website and you can get them in any language, any European language. So obviously I look at the English one, but if you wanted it in Bulgarian, you can have it in Bulgarian.
Right, so times are changing. It's a positive thing. There are some impact, as you said, but people need to arm themselves, A, with the information, and B, with the best advice, whether that's internal or external, so they can bring these next range of innovative products to market.
That's exactly right, I agree.
Ben, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
For more information about PharmaVentures, visit our website.